This module will discuss the continuum of reality so that as we work with a production, we'll understand where you as a team have decided to place the level of reality for the production. This line represents that continuum, going from the far left extreme of naturalism, in which a production might have full natural detail, being as realistic as possible, or following the line the other direction, to the opposite extreme would be theatricalism, in which a production is more stylized and uses theatrical device as part of its means of communication. For example, we might look at this old pickup with all of its full detail and its natural look as it's been weathered and used, and it's become quite colorful because of the effect of nature on its exterior, as opposed to the very theatrical presentation of an old pickup, you might say, used in Disney's production of Cars for the character Mater. Here are two opposites of naturalism and theatricalism. With that in mind, let's think scenically. For the production of Waiting for Godot, produced by the Classical Theater of Harlem in 2007, this theater group actually presented their production on site following the New Orleans flood and used the actual ruins of some of the buildings in that area to produce their production of Waiting for Godot. This is a very naturalistic way of approaching a production, using a very real environment, as opposed to the Berkshire Theatre Festival's production in 2013 for Waiting for Godot, in which the design and the style of the production were very theatrical in their approach. Costume-wise, here are two productions of Midsummer Night's Dream. The first, on the left, produced by the center rep at Lesher Center for the Arts in 2008. This may not be a typical approach for a Shakespearean play, but if we look at the costume design for this, these are very realistic characters, somewhat stylized, somewhat trumped, you might say, but there are really people who dress this way, and it definitely denotes a particular period and a particular style of costume. On the right, we have a more theatricalized production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, produced at the Shakespeare Theatre of New Jersey in 2013. The costumes for this production do not look terribly real. There is a basis for their reality, but as we look at the design, we can maybe pinpoint elements of the design that seem more natural, perhaps, like a jogging suit on the far right, a little bit of a muscle kind of shirt or something on the far left, but ultimately we would have to say this is very theatrical in its presentation, very stylized. For this lighting design comparison for Our Town by Thornton Wilder, we could look to the far left for a more naturalistic approach to the McKenna Theater at SUNY's production of Our Town, in which the characters were a little more realistic and the lighting tended to be a little more directional and tended to set emotion perhaps more, and had a little more natural feeling, we might say. Compared to the far right, in which the Zach Theater of Austin, Texas in 2010 produced Our Town on a very simple set, and the lighting chose to be very stylized in color and in placement, in pinpointing characters and locations for this production. In makeup design, for a production of The Elephant Man, on the left, The Williamstown Theater Festival in 2012 chose not to use any extreme makeup, to go very natural with the actor and allow the actor himself to portray the character simply by the way he held himself and the way he presented his lines. Compared to a very theatrical production produced by El Centro Theater in Los Angeles in 2011 for The Elephant Man, in which extreme prosthetic makeup was used to deform the Elephant Man and to produce a more theatrical production, you might say. So, the Continuum of Reality deals with that reality between naturalism and theatricalism. If I were producing a show in an inner city alley, and when we went to actually film this on site, let's say we were working on a film, and I find 6 to 8 dumpsters and I find graffiti on all the walls, if I choose to clean that up a bit and remove most of the dumpsters and only leave 1 or 2, which is enough to let the audience know where we are, and if I choose to clean off some of the graffiti on the walls, I have somewhat changed that realism, and I have pulled away from a more natural look, which would have been if I left the alley exactly the way I found it. And I've pulled it more to a little more theatrical in the sense that I've just removed elements that were natural to that environment. Now, I'm guessing an audience, when they would come to see that, would see it fairly realistically. We refer to this as selective realism, in which we as a designer choose what end of the continuum we're going to work with. Now let's look at a few designs for production and decide where this team has decided to live on this selective realism continuum. For this production of Autumn Garden at Williamstown Theater Festival in 2007, the full design chose to find some sort of a reality for the environment in this production. We would look at the set design and say this is very much based in reality. The architectural shapes, the detailings, most of the reality, especially in the furnishings, is there. However, the walls seem to be transparent, and that's not real. There is some style pulled away, you might say, towards that theatrical element, allowing us to look through the walls of the house to a pseudo kind of tree look in the background. So there's kind of a blend somewhere tipping towards the theatrical side in this production. Costume-wise, from what we see, it's a fairly natural approach to the costumes. They're fairly real, and the makeup seems to follow that same style. And lastly, we might say the lighting tends to be a little more realistic. We feel motivated lighting coming through an open door. We feel motivated lighting coming on the right, stage left, feeling of light coming through branches of trees. So there seems to be perhaps the most realistic approach is in the costume and the makeup. A little less real perhaps in the lighting, simply by the fact that if this were 100% pure natural lighting, we wouldn't see major corners of this room that we can see here. And then lastly, the set would be a little more theatrical. So we might say that this production, in choosing its continuum of reality, tends to be more realistic in the costumes and the makeup, a little less, but still fairly realistic in the lighting, and a little less realistic in its scenic choices. So you look at this one, stop for just a minute, and make some decisions in the scenic, lighting, costumes, and makeup for this production. So, looking at your notes, what would you say about the set? There's some very real-looking trees. In fact, it looks to me like they may have used real tree trunks to create some of this set. But this lift of stairs and an upper platform is fairly theatrical, so there's kind of a blend. Somewhere we're in between a naturalistic world and a theatrical world. Costume-wise, it's a little hard to tell from just the costumes we see here, but if we are indeed in a production of Cinderella, we're saying that they are wearing costumes that we might believe come from that period, and doesn't look to me like their hair or their makeup is extreme. It's fairly natural, so we would probably say that, again, the costumes and the makeup tend to be a little more natural in this production. The set is somewhere in between the two worlds. We have to also, when we speak scenically, talk about the birds fluttering overhead. These are probably not real birds. We can look and see that they're more than likely man-made, and that's somewhat artificial, but with a little bit of style. Lighting for this production, overall, if we would ignore the instruments that we can see, because it was a physical choice for them to show the lighting instruments, they could have tried to hide them much more. By seeing the lighting, it's a little bit more stylized, though we have to admit that the colorization that's on stage is really fairly natural, doesn't look too artificial. So again, lighting probably is somewhere in between as well, but a little more to the theatrical side. So in this one, I guess, again, I would say costumes and makeup tend to ride the more natural side of the scale. The set is somewhere in between, and the lighting has gone a little more extreme towards the theatrical side. Take a moment now and write down what you think about the areas of design in this production of Passing Strange. Passing Strange was produced by Sundance Institute Theater Lab, and they developed a new script about the black character in Europe and the history of the blacks in Europe. This production, if we look scenically, we would have to say, I don't know where this world is. This is not very natural. This is very theatrical, seems to me. Now, costumes and makeup, again, from what I can see, look really fairly natural again. I don't see a lot of extremes. There is perhaps some coloring in the costumes that tie characters together, that make it a little more theatrical. And then lighting. Lighting-wise, it looks to me like the lighting is taking its a catalyst from the set, that we have all these neon lights, and that anything on stage is trumped from that most of the ambient light seems to almost feel like it comes from the lights that are part of the set. And then we've added in some spotlighting to help us pick out some characters, such as our audio star here leaned over with his microphone. Therefore, we would say that the lighting is still fairly theatrical. It does play this environment fairly well, but it matches the set quite a bit. And we could even make a comment about sound, because I think we get to see where most of our sound is. We would have to say sound, in most of the sense, might be fairly natural, because it looks like it's being produced live. This isn't taped. I don't think there's a lot of an audio recording for this production. And a lot of the sound is natural through microphones for the live performance. So in this production, I guess what would we say? We would say that of all the elements, probably the costume, well, the makeup, first of all, and even maybe some of the sound is more natural. Then costumes would come in, fairly natural, but somewhat stylized to go with coloring, perhaps, to tie characters together. And then scenic and lighting move clear to the extreme of theatricality in this production. For this last production, again, take some time to write down what you think about the continuum of reality within this production. For the Threepenny Opera, produced at the Depot Theater in Phillipstown, New York in 2010, we get a strong sense that the set is trying to environmentally place us within probably a very tight, confined European setting, maybe London. We're not quite sure just from the set, but we get a sense of fairly textured, natural brick feeling to what's going on. And so most of the elements tend to be fairly natural. The setup may not be terribly natural, but we probably could find an alley in London that might have a layout somewhat like this, with apartments across from each other. There's obviously some mirroring going on with some of the styles that are happening, but even the light posts tend to look like they're researched and fairly natural. Costume-wise, I think we're again fairly natural. The makeup looks like it's fairly natural. It does look like the cast is a bit mixed for age, and so they've had to perhaps trump some of the age. We do maybe see some of that on our character on the far right bottom, that he's been aged perhaps a little bit with his makeup. It's a little hard to tell from this scene. The lights are a little severe. But there's a character in kind of a top hat, it looks like, at center, up left just a little bit for us. That looks like he's got some extreme makeup around his eyes as well. So the makeup might be a bit stylized for this production, but it's a little hard to tell from just this simple photo. We might say that while I did say that costumes were fairly natural, I do look around again now and notice that some characters are a little more caricature, you might say. Our character in the bottom left in our picture, that's in his red vest, but he's got some sort of unusual trim around the lapels of that costume. Our character in the top left balcony, who looks perhaps a little stylized, maybe a street walker. Our policeman up center seem to be pretty stylized. So there's a bit of a mixture, and our character, some of our hats on our characters and some of the accessories might look a little more stylized. Lighting seems to be very stylized. I don't think I really sensed that the one motivated light source on stage that I can see, which is that lamppost, really is the source of light for most of this environment. So the lighting is a little more unnatural, we might say. I even feel there's a strong warm light down center, and there is more white flat light up above on most of the characters. And then there's a lot of color in some of the extremes that are being painted on the walls and around the characters, so that the lighting is somewhat stylized also. So, if we were to start at the left and look more natural, we might say, well, perhaps the set might live at the natural end of this spectrum more than all the other designs, and costumes fairly close, but there's some stylized stuff going on there as well. Then we might move out on the makeup a little bit and say it's fairly natural, but there's some stylized stuff going on. And then I would probably move into the lights and say that as we're moving theatrical, the furthest extreme we would go in the lighting for this production. This may not agree exactly with what you saw, but it's at least a good conversation about the continuum of reality within a production. So we've learned that in the continuum of reality, it's important to know where we're placing ourselves in each of the areas. We may have noticed as we were looking at these that there tends to be a placement somewhat consistent with some of the elements. Costumes tend to ride on the natural side of most productions. Audiences have a hard time relating to characters who aren't in real or natural type of costumes. It's a little hard to relate to characters if they're not more natural. Sets live somewhere in between and tends to vary back and forth a little bit, but lives frequently in the very center of that continuum of reality and has elements of the natural and elements of the theatrical. Lighting tends to perhaps ride a little more at the theatrical aspect in the sense of comparing it to costumes and sets, but not always. Makeup probably would live down towards the natural side, and sound would probably tend to ride in the center and up towards the theatrical a little bit also. The simple idea that we might need to amplify a production so the audience can hear it is not natural, and therefore sound, because it's coming through a sound system, will always be somewhat theatrical. So as we consider the complete continuum of reality, we mention consistency. As long as these elements of design live somewhere in that continuum and consistently live there, the audience will most generally believe us. We need to bridge gaps as we work on that continuum. If suddenly costumes that are in a natural mode, perhaps for production, suddenly introduce a very theatrical element, that will jar an audience, it will stick out. So we might need to have some sort of a bridge, another character that's kind of a mix of natural and theatrical to prepare us for a more theatrical step later on. That would happen in the sets or the lights or the sound or the makeup as well. That if we're going to go to an extreme, suddenly in the production, we probably might want to take steps or bridge that gap for the audience so they'll believe it when it takes place. The main thing we want to think about in this continuum is that the design team understands where they live on this continuum and that we have a strong understanding of what elements of the show might be more natural and which elements of the show might be more theatrical, so that there's a consistency understood by the design team in the way the production presents itself. Hopefully, this discussion of the continuum of reality helps you as you decide on your own designs for production, and particularly might help you in analyzing design when you see it done.